After a year that has been particularly unkind to apparel, many of us are wondering what the fate of the category might be. Consumers are spending, but just not on apparel. Even before the pandemic, many brands were struggling. So where are the opportunities for fashion brands? And what do we need to do to move away from relying on discounts and promotions? I'm Jane Singer, and welcome to A Seat at the Table. Today, I'm speaking with Glenn McMahon, a fashion and brand consultant with an impressive multi-decade track record of helping brands become retail winners. Most recently, Glenn was operating partner at TRAUB after having served as CEO at St. John Knits. Prior to that, he held C-suite roles at other international apparel brands. Glenn will be sharing his view of what brands need to do to meet what today's consumers want. He also dives into where he sees opportunities, even in a challenging market. Before we get started, if you're overwhelmed with information but need a view of global sourcing, then you might want to take a look at the current situation in sourcing. These concise, easy-to-read snapshot reports have been a lifesaver for many sourcing directors, saving them days of tedious work. You can learn more at www.currentsituation.net. That's www.currentsituation.net. Now let's sit down with Glenn and get an expert view on apparel brands. Glenn, thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate it. I think that everybody is trying to figure out maybe not what the new normal is going to be in 2021, but certainly what may be transpiring on the fashion side, because we've really seen a year of people relying on something that might be called casual wear / loungewear. And will this continue, or will there be a demand for people to do something different? What do you think?
Are we ever going to get out of sweatpants?
Right, exactly. Exactly right.
Well, despite how dire the situation is, I remain optimistic. I think that this past year has been a big wake-up call for the fashion industry. As you and I have spoken before, a lot of the problems that we're faced with today existed prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic only accelerated the need to address these. So I am encouraged to see there are retailers that are what I would say doing a really good job navigating through this, and I applaud their efforts. And hopefully the rest of the industry can follow suit. Conversely, there are those that I think missed the beat, were well behind to begin with, and are trying to play catch up, and the jury is out on whether or not they will. But specifically to your question, there are sectors that are booming, and activewear and loungewear are certainly sectors, as are food and home and pet. So, I'm encouraged to see those sectors of business in the consumer product area do quite well, despite how difficult the situation has been. And I think that we'll see some of those trends continue after the new normal comes into play. It doesn't mean that we're going to be living in Lululemon or sweatpants for the rest of our lives, but I do think consumer behaviors have changed and priorities have changed. And as we're working remotely and we're working from home or we're working from anywhere, and that's not going to change anytime soon. People are adjusting to how they dress, what they eat, what their workout regimen, their skincare regimen is. And I think a lot of these are good opportunities for the consumer business. So I remain optimistic despite how tough it is out there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see what sectors have been doing well and whether those will continue to do well as we head into 2021, or whether people will sort of have as much loungewear and activewear as they need, having bought so much of that in 2020.
Activewear, as you said, has been a standout. Footwear and sneakers have done incredibly well. So yeah, the sectors, some of them were strong before. I mean, if you look at Lululemon was posting great numbers, Nike was doing really well prior to the pandemic, and the fact that both of them with large retail footprints were able to pivot over to a digital first strategy bodes really well for them, not only now, but going forward, because I do think that the percentage of business that's done online now is not going to all of a sudden reverse and go back down. I think the retail stores will continue to be important, but their format has to change. So there are clearly some winners out there. I mean, I read an interesting statistic recently about Nordstrom's in their quarterly report that over 54% of their business was being done online. And that's really phenomenal because Only a year ago, if retailers were doing 20% of their business online, they were bragging about it. But the bar has been raised. And I think it's not unrealistic to think that 60% of a brick and mortar retailer's business would come from online. And their stores will shift. They won't go away, but they will become experience centers. They will become fulfillment centers. So there's going to be a big dynamic, a shift in what a physical retail store services and what it does. And we've seen some big box retailers like Target and Walmart adapt very quickly and do an amazing job. And all the food stores have done a great job as far as order online, pick up at curb, all the return. So there's a lot of good things coming out of this, I've got to say, from small companies to large companies.
Yeah, definitely. It certainly pushed people to make changes and to be able to be responsive in ways that they had never thought they could be before.
Yeah, and a lot of the technology existed. I give those brands credit that were on that path to begin with, or those that accelerated their investment to support these technologies because they've been around, and retailers were often lazy not to adopt them. But this technology has existed before, so I'm encouraged to see the empowerment of the technology to satisfy what the customer needs when the customer needs it.
So when you're looking specifically at apparel, long before the pandemic, apparel sales, other than in the luxury sector, have been heavily driven by promotions and discounting. In your opinion, why has apparel not been able to detox from discounting?
Well, I think it's been systemic for a long time. We have too much product, there are too many brands, there are too many stores, and our production or our product life cycle is completely broken. There's a big movement toward what is called on-demand production, which I'm a big fan of. So we're creating less excess, so hence we'll have less promotions and markdowns. It's sort of a vicious cycle, and I think that even fast fashion is waking up to the fact that they can't just produce these enormous quantities, just they have no value whatsoever. They get marked down and then they're ending up in landfills. And the younger consumer in particular is very sensitive and aware of this. So I think there's a couple of different movements that are happening at the same time that are really going to address this inventory management situation. First and foremost, the supply has been cut off because of the pandemic. So there's not an excess of supply right now in the pipeline. There had been, back in March because orders were canceled and production was canceled. But we've sort of worked our way through that. So I think going forward, retailers are going to understand they have to be leaner and meaner, and that's going to make that on-demand production capability even more important. And I think a less reliance on global sourcing and a more reliance on local sourcing. So you can make a couple hundred of something, put it in your stores, put it online, and then react and respond to it. So again, I'm optimistic to see those types of things pick up speed.
The fast fashion model, when it was first rolled out, was really more of a responsive model. It's become to be sort of synonymous with cheap and nasty fashion, right? But actually, the fast fashion model was designed to be something where it was made in a certain quantity, it was sold through, and then something else was brought in, as opposed to reorder in huge quantities.
That, I think, is more akin to the on-demand manufacturing or production capabilities that we're going to see going forward. I think what's happened with fast fashion, and this happened over the course of years, is they were more stores because they were lazy and they weren't driving their business digitally. Most of the fast fashion players like H&M and Zara were late to the game online. And they had hundreds of stores, and they had to fill these stores with product. So just by that very nature, they were creating excess that there was no demand for, that was going to have to be marked down or go into the landfill. So I think now with the contraction of the number of doors, it doesn't mean the stores will go away, but I think that they're going to be, instead of having to fill these hundreds of stores, the inventory will be sitting in a central location. So it will require that they build less inventory because they can fulfill it from either their warehouses or from their stores as fulfillment centers.
Right, right. So you see it more as sort of an operational logistics, more of an upstream management side of things than an actual product issue.
Well, interesting. I do. I think the larger issue, but I would have to say that there's been a lot of bad, cheap product out there that there was never any demand for from the consumer side, and that's why we had such heavy promotions. I mean, they have just missed product, year after year, season after season, which is why they've had to become so heavily promotional. So they've just had product misses. So there are examples of where it has been bad product for a number of reasons that have, led to the markdowns and the promotions. Yeah, the week and they're on sale. And there's no value equation at all. Is it worth $19 or $9? I mean,
Well, I think that's a very good point, and I think that from a consumer point of view, people are very unsure as what something is actually worth, particularly when the consumer's been educated that no matter what it is, it's going to be on sale with at least 30% off in a couple of weeks after it hits the floor. So you do start to wonder. You lose all sense of, like you said, price value.
well, I also think the pandemic has accelerated that also because we've seen that we can get by with less. So, maybe before you walked around and you walked into a store and something was on sale and you bought it because it was cheap and you figured out you could use it. But now you don't have that opportunity. And I think people are being a lot more discreet about their purchases. And a lot of that is economically driven because they're nervous about their jobs and the economy and whatnot. So I do think that those are some of the behaviors that will remain after the pandemic. It will be more discretionary shopping, even for commodity items. So it will be more driven. And luxury, you mentioned earlier, I think is a perfect example. They were always successful on scarcity. And I think the luxury players have realized that they have too many stores and they've been, distributed into too many wholesale accounts. So they're pulling back to growing their online business and their own brick and mortar stores. So I do think that we'll see a lot less excess inventory out there, which will cause a lot less promotions. And we'll see a better balance between a true price value.
So do you think that looking ahead, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that people are much more thoughtful shoppers long before the pandemic, but as you said, certainly accelerated by the pandemic. Do you look at the consumer going forward? And granted, there's many different psychographics and demographics of consumers, but in general, do you see people looking for things more driven by price, or do you feel that people will be looking for quality and willing to pay for quality?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. So the younger generation is definitely looking to buy less, and their purchase decisions are based on transparency and fairness and, real price value. And they're very open to the secondary market. So the younger generation is really driving a very different experience in retail. They're not consumptuous consumers. They're much more thoughtful about what they buy, spending their money on things other than apparel. So their priorities are food and beverage and home, is not at the top of their list. So I do think and their behavior will influence other people as well. But I think as their percentage to the total population continues to increase, that's where we're going to see the shift in retail. They buy based on need. They buy based on transparency. They buy based on price value. And they're open to buying from the secondary market. They're fine with something that was certified and pre-owned. They like vintage. So I think those are trends there. From the luxury consumer, I mean, from what I hear from brands that I've spoken with, is that consumer is not stopping spending, but they are being much more discreet on what they're buying. They're buying clothing or jewelry much more like they would buy art or furniture. And they're thinking, okay, this isn't about this season. This is something that I really love and it's high quality and I want, to wear it for a longer period of time. So I do think that there are really interesting shifts in how consumer is buying or purchasing apparel.
Right. I think that's very interesting. So in general, are you seeing a shift away from things that are very trendy and more of a migration towards things that are classics?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that it's more based on emotion. I think there are two things. If something is absolutely beautiful and makes you feel good, but isn't something that you're only going to wear for one time and then throw it away. So I think it's a little bit of a combination, but I do think there still is that emotional part that is driving the purchase. I do think that there's a big part of the functionality and performance right now, and that will be the interesting part to see if that lasts. And that's why sectors like activewear and outerwear and sneakers have done well, is because people know that they're easy to take care of. They have a performance and a functionality So there's a practicality to that. So a lot of the businesses that are doing well aren't these frivolous, crazy, outlandish things, but they're not necessarily boring commodities.
Right. So it's not a back to basics specifically, but it's also not a rush to things that are, as you said, wild and crazy and sort of a one season and then it all of a sudden looks dated.
I think it's more about longevity. Am I going to get use out of this? How long can I wear this? Is it well made? Those are the factors that are going into, can I wear this with more than one thing? And we talked about the loungewear, the act of being so strong. If you look at, people are spending a lot of money on sneakers, and, Lululemon and Nike are not inexpensive. So they're spending the money on that, and they want to look good, but first and foremost, they want to be comfortable. So I don't think it's about the lowest common denominator being price. I do think it's about function and comfort, and there is some style and look still, that's important. And I think proof of that is you look at a lot of the luxury brands and what they're selling is activewear. They're selling a lot of sneakers. They're selling a lot of sweatshirts and T-shirts. And all you have to do is look at any European luxury brand, and a good percentage of their offering is what we would typically call streetwear influenced.
Right. I think that's very interesting because previously it was certainly a lot more dressed up. And it's not just the pandemic that has made that change. A lot of these changes, as we discussed earlier, were already in the works. So from the point of view of a brand who's saying, I need to make some changes, I need to get back on track. And I'm not talking about a luxury brand, but a mid-tier brand or perhaps even a more mass market brand. What advice would you give? What would you, and I know it's different depending upon what brand it is, but in general, what are some of the moves that some of these bigger brands that are really struggling right now need to do in order to reconnect, in a sense, with the consumer?
Well, that's interesting that you ask, because that's really what I've been spending the last 5 years doing. I was the CEO of St. John Knits from 2000 to 13, and that was a turnaround that we did, and we sold it to Fosun, which is a Chinese-backed company, in 2013. And I started my own advising and consulting firm just because I felt that after what I had done at St. John and some of my other experiences, that I would be able to bring that kind of expertise to other retailers or brands. And I spent a lot of time doing that. And on a recent project, without naming the name, it was a mid-tier or lower price point brand that was in the intimate space, and they had hundreds of stores, and they had a couple challenges. And so, I went in there. There's usually never one problem or one fit solution that solves everything. So it's, a 360 evaluation that we do. And in that particular case, they didn't have a strong enough digital presence. And this was prior to the pandemic that I took on the assignment. And they had hundreds of stores, and there were a number of leases that were coming up. So first and foremost, we looked at, the real estate footprint, and we're making some tough decisions on whether to renew leases or not. But we knew that our focus was to shift a larger percentage of the business online over a 3-year period, because that's where their customer was shopping. They had a younger customer. So that was, one of the big parts of it. The other two parts of it were the product and the marketing. And they were sort of connected, because the marketing had been very out there, very sexual, very sort of 80s inspired, if you will. And the consumer in this particular sector had moved away from that. And it was about much more inclusivity and much more about empowerment. So a lot of the product reflected that overt sexuality also. So what we did simultaneously was started redrafting what that vision for that brand would be. That would be a much more modern, much more inclusive, and then made sure that the product aligned with that. And then the last part of it was the sourcing model. The lead time that they were working on was way too far out. Because they had so many stores, they were building product just to fill the stores. They were not building product based on the integrity of the product. And as we were increasing the digital footprint, that allowed us, and closing some of the stores, that allowed us to draw back on the amount of product that we were producing to make our lead time shorter, and we could be more reactive to the product. So a lot of the things that we've discussed previously, but that's what I go in and look at is, first of all, try to understand who the customer is, how they're dealing with the customer, what is their, what investments have they made in technology to support a digital first strategy, what are their marketing messages relevant to today's world, and, obviously product.
I think those are all good points. And so often when you look at brands, you do feel that they don't understand who their customer is, and that very often they're looking at demographics rather than psychographics. Where a lot of them are missing the mark is just not understanding who that customer really is, what they want.
Yeah. I think the big part of my focus has really been on process improvement and around. And one of the first things that I do when I take on an assignment is really look at the customer, because it is consumer driven today. And gone are the days where the brands dictate to the consumer what they should be buying, what they should be wearing, when they should buy it, and how they should wear it. And so I do think that's probably the biggest challenge that you have, is that brands that have lost touch with who their consumer is. And then conversely, there are other brands that are doing a really good job out there with high engagement with their consumer. So they're much more in tune with what their consumer wants.
So when you're looking at brands, there's been a lot of traditional brands that have been around for a long time that were very successful, and that in recent years have really suffered a lot. I think a lot of them were popular with people who were in, let's say, the baby boomer generation, and that now they're trying to appeal to a millennial or a Gen Z. In your opinion, can a brand make that leap? When it comes to fashion, you don't want to wear what your mother wore. Do you know what I'm saying? So if growing up your mother wore certain brands, it's not that it was a bad brand, but you want something different just for the sake that, you don't want to wear what your parents wore.
Yeah. Well, I do think that great brands stand the test of time. I'm going to use a couple VF brands as examples. If you look at Vans, that's a perfect example. It's been around for a really long time, since the 1960s. It's hugely successful, multi-billion-dollar, cross-generational. So you see young kids wearing it, and you see older, baby boomers wearing it also. The North Face is another great example of that too. So I think it's about having the right product for what the consumer wants. And those are both great categories that are particularly strong. But also going to consumers going. That customer is shopping at independent retailers, the younger customer, or shopping online. They're not going into major department stores. So they're discovering brands online, or they're discovering stores and specialty retailers. So I think that if you have a great brand that was appeal to baby boomers, and you want to appeal to a younger generation, and you have a great product, I think, one of the things that you have to look at are your distribution channels. I mean, young people are not walking into Macy's. So if I were, VF Corporation, and I was only selling Macy's, I would be missing the opportunity for a lot of young consumers to come in and discover Vans or the North Face. But the fact of the matter is that they were selling a lot of independent retailers. They were strong online, and they have their own network of retail stores that customer, has been able to discover them there. So, I don't think it's ever too late. Gucci is another good example on a luxury level that has reinvented itself, that appeals to cross-generational customers. Maybe my parents wore Gucci and I didn't think it was cool, but now I think both younger generation and baby boomers, can find something. So I think brands can navigate cross-generation. I think it's about having great product and making sure that you're serving the customer where they're shopping.
Right. You were mentioning that the younger generation is shopping in independent stores. Do you see that in addition to online as something that's growing fast?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it's growing fast. I mean, the independents, unfortunately, have been slammed, particularly this past year with the crisis. Some, are closing. But I know that younger customers prefer to shop in what I'm going to call mono retailers, even if they have multiple doors, or in a brand's own. They still like the physical shopping experience. But they'll do a lot of research online, and then they'll go check it out in person, and then they may go back home and order it online because they like the convenience of shopping when they want to shop. But I do think independent retailers, I hope they can survive the pandemic, and I know that they're an important part of the retail ecosystem.
I think that's interesting because I'm hearing more and more from people about the return of independent retailers, whereas for, I would say, at least a decade, probably longer, they'd been swept aside. So it's interesting to see that this is a format that might be the next new thing.
Well, it could be. And, I think what they've done well is they have highly curated, edited merchandise selection. So you could go into there and you could find something different that you don't find the department stores are pretty much all look the same and they all carry the same product. And it's really difficult for you to, a reason to buy something there. So I do think that there is hope out there for, again, provided they have the capital to make it through the next, year. It's been really tough. We've seen a lot of small businesses close.
Yeah, certainly. Lockdowns and things like that have made it really, really tough. How important or how much added value, in your opinion, is this idea of a retailer who's able to be, I would say, more of a merchant, who's finding unique product and is able to then curate it, and when a customer comes in, be able to help them create their own personal style?
I think that's critical, and I think that's been the goal, particularly in the U.S., of our department store business. And if you look at the rest of the world, that's not the case. Selfridge's business is phenomenal because they do a highly curated, edited, with a point of view. They do a lot of exclusives with brands. Matches is another one. Holt Renfrew in Canada, I think, has done an outstanding job. And also Lane Crawford in Hong Kong, where there's still that you go in there and their point of view is unique and distinct. Here in the U.S., I would say it's very much, you go into, when Barney's was still in business, Barney's, Minzer, Saks, you find the same thing. Saks, Bloomingdale's, Nordstrom, the exact same merchandise, almost to a T. So there wasn't really anything unique or different. I think Nordstrom's had a better service, offering, so they were able to hold on to their customer. They also moved more quickly online than the other department stores did, so they had that as an advantage. But I would say that the American department stores, if they heard something was hot, they all wanted it, they all bought it, and they all started looking the same. I would say in the rest of the world, that did not happen, and there were less stores, and there were more edited and highly curated. So they acted more like a specialty retailer, which is what a department store is to be.
I think that's a good point. I think that it really gets down to the idea of being unique, about providing people with something that's more personalized.
And proof is, from a luxury level, these brands like Gucci and Prada are pulling back, and Chanel, their distribution from the U.S. department stores, because they know that they were over-distributed, and to drive their business to their company-owned boutiques or online. So you're going to see less of those brands in these stores.
But do you think that it's really that the department stores were that big a channel in and of themselves, or were there other areas that you feel are saturating the market, so to speak?
No, I just think that younger people weren't going into the department stores. So I think that was their biggest challenge. And they weren't creating that excitement, and they were, not building out the technology for a digital platform. So I think those are probably some of the bigger issues that were hurting the department store business in the U.S.
Right. Well, certainly department stores were struggling, and then hit with the pandemic didn't make things any better.
Well, and it's a little tough, in all fairness, they weren't declared essential businesses, so they weren't able to stay open yet. Target and Walmart have built out their apparel offering, their food and beverage, and their drug, beauty and wellness. So there has been an unfair playing field, for the department stores or for the smaller independents, because these large, big box retailers have been able to remain open because they had a grocery or a wellness, a pharmacy attachment.
Yeah, definitely that's not been fair, but I think it'll be interesting to see going forward how all of this shakes out, and whether or not department stores will reinvent themselves will be very interesting to see. And if they do, what will they be carrying?
They need to, but they've needed to start it already. So if they haven't started, I'm afraid that it might be a little too late. Yeah, I do think there are some good examples of, what we call a department store. I mean, Selfridges probably doesn't consider itself a department store, nor does Lane Crawford. They consider themselves specialty retailers.
I guess it's a double-edged sword, because you have to work on the product side of things, and then you also have to redo your entire supply chain. Not necessarily find new vendors, but as you were saying, you need to be doing shorter runs. You need to be doing them closer to the season. For a large company, that's a very big shift.
It is a big shift. I mean, they have their work cut out for them. And whether it's a department store or it's a brand, they have their work cut out for them. But again, the writing has been on the wall for years, and these guys have just been really slow to respond. So they've gotten themselves caught in a situation where they're trying desperately to play catch up. And, I don't doubt that they can do it. My question is whether they're doing it fast enough.
Right, right. Well, that's going to be the big thing, because change is difficult. Nobody likes change.
Yeah, and I do think that their ownership or their management needs to be a little bit more open to taking on some outside help, advisors or consultants to help them through, because oftentimes the existing management team, though capable as they might not have had the experience in the process improvement or the turnaround, and you don't want to get into a situation where it's distressed. I think smart business and smart ownership realizes this, and they're not afraid to bring in outside help to help them with the process improvement and the turnaround. And that's really what I've been focused on, and that's what I'm excited about for brands and retailers, is they can complement their existing teams by bringing in, whether it's an interim management or an advisor or consultant, to help them get there. It's heavy lifting, and it's often times not a skill set that the existing leadership team has, and that's not to take anything away from the leadership team. They just, it's all hands on deck, and they need more hands.
That is a really interesting concept, and I think that's very prescient, because I think a lot of companies, whether they be brands or retailers or anybody else in the supply chain, everybody is strapped for help because nobody wants to be taking on large payrolls. But at the same time, you need more help and you need more ideas and input coming in. So to be able to take people on, whether it be in an interim role or as a consultant, sometimes you can't afford to hire a person at that level full time, but you could afford to hire part of a person. And part of a person can be actually rather effective and help you with that and bring that new point of view to the table. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, again, I look at it as there's nothing to be ashamed about it, and it certainly is a better alternative than having to go through a liquidation process or a bankruptcy. So I think what I'm going to call healthy companies can benefit from process improvement and around. You don't have to be, the white flag does not have to be up before you bring in extra help. And I would highly encourage, brands and retailers to rethink, how can we shore up our existing team? How can we complement them? How can we give them extra resources to get through these difficult, what are going to be next 12 or 18 months, so we can get our business back on track? Because you don't often have the bandwidth. And to be honest, a lot of these leaders are putting out daily fires. And so they don't have the ability or the time necessarily to focus on what that next 190 days looks like, or what that next 18 months looks like. And that's the kind of thought leadership that they would really benefit from.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to be able to brainstorm, to be able to get input from somebody who's had experience but is not within their own company, brings a new vision. I think there's a lot to be considered, and there's a lot of opportunity out there for companies. There's a lot of talented people right now who are in positions where they can work with companies on a consulting basis. So I think that could be a huge opportunity for many of these brands and retailers.
Yeah, I think there's been too much focus on just where they've gone into receivership or declaring bankruptcy. And I think it's that old adage, a stitch in time, that if you can bring in this help earlier on the process improvement into the turnaround, that you can lead to greater success.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Glenn, thank you so much for sharing all these insights. I think right now everybody is trying to figure out where things are going next, and getting insights from someone with your depth of experience is certainly very valuable.
Well, yeah, and like I said in the beginning of our conversation, I remain very optimistic about this space. I see some winners out there, and I think that we all just need to button down, and we can get through this. There are going to be some brands or retailers that go by the wayside. They probably would have regardless of the pandemic or not. But I remain optimistic about the sector. There are real good opportunities out there for sure.
Well, that's very good to hear. And certainly it'll be an interesting year in 2021. But hopefully, since we sort of know what's coming, because we've had a year of having gone through it, I think that many companies will be better prepared.
I hope so too.
Thanks again, Glenn. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe to our podcast so you'll never miss another episode? And if you're struggling to get your sourcing forecast report done, the current situation in sourcing is the answer to your prayers. It provides a sharp and concise snapshot of the situation in major sourcing nations along with key data in an easy-to-read format. You can find details in the show notes for this podcast. Thank you, and see you in the next podcast.